and it's good to join. It looks like we've reached a critical mass, so I'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Megan Zacher, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am a senior program officer on the Increasing and Diversifying Education Abroad for U.S. Students, or IDEAS program, which is funded by the U.S. Department of State through the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs USA Study Abroad branch, and is implemented by World Learning. I am very excited to welcome you to the first of our workshops in the 2022-2023 workshop series. This workshop is titled Expanding Access and Inclusion, Developing Holistic Strategies for Recruiting and Supporting Students from Underrepresented Groups, and is hosted by our wonderful partners at the University of Washington Tacoma. You can go to the next slide. For a brief overview of the IDEAS program, as I mentioned, it is funded by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and our goal is to expand higher education institutions' capacity to grow and diversify study abroad programs for U.S. students. We aim to increase the number of students who go abroad, the number of higher education institutions that offer study abroad programs, and the number and types of destinations that students are traveling to. And we do this in two ways. One is through our annual grant competition, which awards grants to higher education institutions in the US for up to $35,000. And that the 2022 competition is nearing the end of its cycle right now, but we anticipate opening another competition towards the end of this year. And then our second way of increasing capacity is through our capacity building initiatives, like the one you are taking part in today. These workshops and webinars are free and open to everyone interested in attending. And we also host a library of resources on our website, studyabroadcapacitybuilding.org, where you can find resources from our events and the field. And with that, on the next slide, it's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Johnson, who is a program officer for USA Study Abroad within the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, or ECA, where she oversees a portfolio of capacity building and professional development initiatives. She manages the IDEAS program, which provides grants and resources to help U.S. colleges and universities expand their study abroad programming. And she also oversees professional development workshops for study abroad advisors and alumni of the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program and the Critical Language Scholarship Program. Rebecca?
Great. Thank you, Megan, and hello, everyone. Welcome. It is so great to be here today with you, and I'm really thrilled that we are kicking off what I am sure is going to be a dynamic workshop series on expanding access and inclusion in study abroad. Many thanks to our colleagues at the University of Washington Tacoma for planning this series, especially Cindy Scharschmidt, Courtney Kroll, Dr. Jeff Cohen for their leadership on this project and their entire team. Thank you as well to Nicole Baldwin and Dr. Nicole Webster for sharing their insights with us today. And of course, thanks to Megan Suad and the IDEAS program team for guiding this initiative. We're all here today because we are committed to creating equitable access to study abroad for all students, which is a worthwhile cause, as I'm sure we would all agree. I do want to acknowledge, though, that the process of unpacking social identities, reflecting upon personal and institutional biases, and charting a new path forward may not always be an easy process. So just to begin this workshop series, I hope that we can all extend grace to each other and to ourselves. We are here to learn and share, and I think we have a really great group coming together to do that. Hopefully you all will get to know each other through this workshop series, but you come from many different backgrounds, from institutions in more than 30 states and territories, 2-year and 4-year institutions, various minority serving institutions, and different levels of experience in the study abroad field. I really think those diversity viewpoints will only enrich our conversations over the coming weeks, and I hope you grow to appreciate and learn from each other. And also to share your own insights. It may sound counterintuitive, but I think it is true to assume that every person here can find common ground with someone else, and that every person here also has unique insights to bring to the group. I will acknowledge that as a white woman working in study abroad from middle-class America, I get imposter syndrome every time I talk about diversity, access, and inclusion, but I hope we can all fight through those barriers and find great things to share. I really just wanted to keep my remarks brief here at the top because I think we have some great presenters here today who can really speak this topic much more than I can. I do want to, though, just take a quick moment to highlight two additional opportunities from the USA Study Abroad team at the State Department that may be of interest to you all as you are joining this workshop focusing on expanding access. First, I want to highlight that our Critical Language Scholarship Program, or CLS program, which hopefully many of you are aware of, but if not, it provides fully funded immersive programs for US undergraduate and graduate students to study one of 15 critical languages overseas each summer. As part of the CLS program, we are very excited to announce the launch of a new virtual CLS Spark initiative. Through this initiative, we really hope to expand access to students who may not have the ability to go overseas and study in person intensively each summer. Oh, thank you, Megan, for pulling up the website there. So through CLS Spark, participants will spend an academic year learning either Arabic, Chinese, or Russian through online virtual classes and activities facilitated by native speakers at host institutions abroad. Spark is open to any American undergraduate student enrolled at an accredited US-based degree granting program, and no previous experience in these languages is required. So if you have students who are interested in these languages, maybe can't quite pull out a full study abroad program for whatever reason, this could be a great initiative to flag for them. I'll also flag that along with our CLS program, USA Study Abroad's other primary program for US students is the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program, which provides scholarships of up to $5,000 to US undergraduate Pell Grant recipients to engage in virtual or in-person study or intern abroad programs. I really encourage you to look more into that program if you are not familiar with it. gilmanscholarship.org is the website. But I will highlight that USA Study Abroad is getting ready to announce a series of training workshops for US colleges and universities, so presumably everyone here on the call, that will focus on best practices in recruiting and supporting applicants for the CLS program and Gilman program. And through these workshops, we really are going to try to hone in on institution types and student types that we want to do a better job of engaging and supporting in our programs. So just a little preview, how can I sign up for the workshop? I see the question in the chat, wonderful question. We'll be sending around an email about that soon. This is just a little teaser, but wanted to keep it all on your radar as you think about additional Department of State resources for engaging diverse students in study abroad. With that, I will turn it back over to today's workshop team. Before I do, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you all, the participants, for joining. I hope that you share your thoughts and that you find this information actionable on your campuses, and that you will walk away from the end of this series with exciting plans to implement on your own campuses. So again, thank you, everyone. And I believe I am turning it over to Cindy. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Megan, for the introduction. And I want to once again welcome everybody to today's workshop, which, as Megan and Rebecca already indicated, is part of a series of workshops that we're hosting with colleagues from all over the United States. And today's session is focused on social identities and study abroad. And we'll focus on the ways that program directors of study abroad programs, and specifically their social identities, can impact the design and delivery of study abroad programs. In a moment, I'm going to have my co-facilitators introduce themselves, but before I do so, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. And many of you are likely familiar with land acknowledgements at this point. Since we are getting together virtually, and because even us as co-presenters are coming to this webinar from a number of different parts of the country, we're taking a slightly different approach to the land acknowledgement. And so what I'd like to do is invite you all to acknowledge and reflect on the histories of dispossession and forced removal that have allowed for the growth and survival of the United States and our institutions of higher education. As people on occupied territories, we must acknowledge the land, the ancestors who've cared for this land since time immemorial, and all of our Native and Indigenous connections today. In light of these histories, we have a responsibility to take active efforts to partner with Native and Indigenous community members and neighbors to seek justice as we continue our work together as a community of learners, leaders, and educators. And I believe that Noelle was going to share a link in the chat that is a great resource to learn about the Native and Indigenous communities that are in your particular location or region. Next up, I'm going to have my co-facilitators introduce themselves. Noelle, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you so much, Cindy. My name is Noelle Baldwin. So excited to see everyone here today. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director for Diversity, Recruiting, and Advising at IDEAS Abroad, which is a study abroad provider.
Thank you. And then I am Cindy Scharschmidt. I use she, her pronouns, and I work in the Office of Global Affairs at the University of Washington Tacoma. Nicole?
My name is Nicole Webster. I am a professor at Penn State University. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm excited to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I'm excited to hear from you both in a moment. But just to give everybody who's here today a sense of what we're going to talk about today, this is the schedule. We've already done the welcome remarks. Thank you again to Megan and Rebecca for the warm welcome. After we go over the schedule and after we've done introductions, we're actually going to have you engage in some small group discussions, both to help build some community and introduce you to a few other people on this call, and to set the stage and the tone for the conversations that we're going to have today and then throughout the rest of the workshop series. Then Noelle is going to walk us through the community agreements for the workshop series, as well as introduce some relevant terminology that will help guide and shape the discussions that we have today and again through the rest of the series. Since this is an hour-and-a-half long workshop, we are planning to take at least a quick break. We will try our best to have that break take place between 9:15 and 9:20 Pacific. But please bear with us in case we don't quite meet that goal. Either way, there will be a break, I promise. Then Nicole or Dr. Webster will walk us through what is called the social identity wheel activity. And that's really the heart of the workshop in terms of better understanding and reflecting on social identities and how those might impact a study abroad experience for program directors in particular. And then at the end, we will have a few closing remarks. We'll share homework because as you might remember from the workshop description, we will actually always be asking you to do a little bit of work in between the sessions. And the idea here is that, in fact, yes, we want these workshops and to be actionable in your institutional context, and that'll require a little bit of work in between sessions to hopefully help put into place some ideas that you take away from this workshop series. All right. Are there any questions? I don't think so. at least not yet. So as promised, we're gonna take a moment to get to know each other a little bit. And to do that, we're going to put you in small groups. And in those small groups, we ask that you take some time to discuss the following questions. The first one is really meant to be an icebreaker question. So if you could just share with your fellow group members what your go-to dish is for potlucks, right? I think that's kind of a fun question and also relevant in the context of what we're talking about today. And then the second question gets a little bit at the content of the workshop. So you may recall that we asked you to collect some study abroad participation data before this workshop today. I know not everybody will have a chance to collect those data. So even if you didn't, please don't worry. If you have, then I want you to share with your group members what are some areas of strength that you've learned about from your data, or what are some gaps in study abroad participation. And I think that even if you don't have the exact data, you may have a sense of what some of your strengths or gaps are in your institutional context. So please feel free to talk about these questions, even if you haven't had a chance to collect the formal data. All right, with that said, Courtney is going to open up breakout rooms here in a moment, and you'll have about 10 minutes to discuss these questions. I'll make sure to, to sort of send a few reminders throughout. All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Noelle. Go.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And it's great to see everybody coming back in. We didn't lose folks, so thanks for joining with us. Right now, I'm going to just talk briefly about community agreements. So typically in sessions like this and others, we as a community will share what agreements we have as a community moving forward in this discussion. So if we had more time, we would ask for your input as well. But given our experience, we collaborated and we put together a list of some basic and foundational community agreements, which we hope will guide you all through not only this session, but throughout the rest of this series. We'd also like to model this type of community agreement setting, especially as you're working with your own students, your own offices, having discussions around these topics. So I'll read through them quickly. And again, if you need, please turn on the closed captioning if that will assist throughout the process. But our first community agreement is lean into discomfort. Be open to learning, uphold confidentiality. And this is a note I wanted to make. We will not be recording the small group discussions. So, as you all got to know each other, to build some camaraderie, to build some rapport, feel comfortable sharing in those smaller groups as you feel led to. Those will not be recorded. We also want to share responsibility for including all voices. So as you're sharing your experiences, please be mindful of the space that you're taking up. If you are taking up a lot of space, perhaps falling back a little bit and allowing other colleagues to share. If you aren't sharing as much and you notice that, maybe sit and ask, why am I not sharing? Am I feeling some discomfort? Writing some notes and potentially dropping something in the chat too. And we want to kind of amplify that agreement as well. Share responsibility for including all voices. So again, if you notice somebody in a group is trying to perhaps get a point across and they're not being heard, amplifying their voice or asking them to share their perspective if you see that they're trying to share something. We want you to listen, right? Not just to respond. So engaging our active listening skills, which can happen a lot. I know we have all perhaps experienced that in different sectors of our life, whether it be professionally or personally. We want to listen and not just to respond. We also want to center learning and growth. So as you're hearing different perspectives that may be counter to yours or may be challenging, keep in mind the learning process and the growth and maturation process. We hope that this series will help you and hopefully your teams and eventually your students go through as well. It's really important too that if something comes up that isn't sitting well, we're leaning into that discomfort, but also challenging the idea and not the person is something we also want to lift up as an agreement in this space. And then lastly, acknowledging your own positionality. So if you are colleagues of various identities, marginalized identities, are sharing something that you perhaps can't relate to, understanding your own position, your own biases, your own privilege as you go into these discussions is really helpful. And if you're a bit uncertain, understand that this is a safe and a brave space, and we want you to feel comfortable in that. And if there is discomfort, being comfortable with the discomfort, right? So we're going to hold these community agreements. And if there's something else that you feel we should add or that we missed, feel free to drop that in the chat and we'll make note and we can add that along as we go through the session. Again, if we had more time, typically we would be more collaborative and ask for your input at the onset, but we thought these were some foundational agreements that we can all agree on. Next slide, please. And I'm not monitoring the chat, so if anything pops up, Courtney, Cindy, let me know. In terms of relevant terminology, so these are just some examples, right? Why we felt it was important to talk about relevant terminology as it pertains to diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. Maybe that should have been the first one, right? Our lexicon is constantly changing, and especially as it pertains to work within diverse, ethnically diverse, social identity diversity, we understand that it changes quite rapidly. And so we want to highlight the fact that words matter. And it's important that as professionals in the international education space, we don't expect you all to be experts, subject matter experts in every facet of the work that we do, but just understanding that terminology will undoubtedly change and the words that we use matter. In particular, the words to the left are words and language that we've, I think, grown accustomed to using in the education abroad space. So non-traditional, underrepresented, minority, the acronyms of POC or BIPOC, POC, LGBTQ+, MSI, minority serving. All of these are words that we typically use. And the words themselves don't have positive or negative connotation, but how we use them can potentially be harmful. So I think the point of this slide is to show us that the language that we're typically using, some of it had recently, very, very recently, like the term BIPOC, is something that is an acronym that just recently came into our lexicon that we're using perhaps in the past 2 to 3 years more frequently. And so instead of perhaps referring to a group or a population directly, we lump every student in this, every student of a diverse background in this BIPOC umbrella. And for some folks it may be for ease, you only have a certain amount of characters to use in a certain publication, etc., which is there's space for that. But we also want to be intentional about using words that are more based in asset-based language. So this idea of asset-based language, what does it mean? It's a theory that's borrowed from social psychology, social justice, restorative justice fields. Community psychology has been exploring this idea of asset-based language for a long time. And there's a researcher out of the University of Miami, Isaac Prilotensky. He was originally at Duke University, and his work was focused on community well-being, right? And how do we achieve higher levels of community well-being? And one of the suppositions is that by using asset-based language, we focus not on the person. We don't make the person the reason that communities having certain issues or dealing with certain things. We look at it from a systemic lens. So the goal in using more asset-based language versus deficit-based language is that it takes a greater account of historical context. It takes greater account of systematic forces that lead to inequity. So when we talk about, underrepresented students, are they really underrepresented, or have they been historically ignored in different systems that we have set up in the United States? When we talk about non-traditional for whom and by whom? Because, for some students, going to a country on the African continent is not non-traditional. That's something that is inherently part of their culture, their experience, etc. So being cognizant of the words that we're using and why we're using those words is something that we just really wanted to highlight. So again, the words on the left are asset-based language examples. So historically resilient, historically ignored, systematically and historically marginalized, and using specific identity descriptors. So when we're talking about Black students, when we're talking about Latinx students, when we're talking about non-binary students, being specific. So we're not lumping all students in one category, because again, which we'll talk about later in the series, a lot of our students carry various identities, as you yourselves do, and that intersectionality is important to address. So I wanted to share those examples before we go into our next couple of sessions. And keep in mind, this terminology, these terms are ever evolving. And so example, the last point, LGBTQIA2S+. This idea of two-spirit is something that is relatively new to those researching or learning about the LGBTQ plus community. However, this idea of two-spirit has been around for eons, right? So understanding how, as we learn and unlearn, our language will evolve and change, and being open to that evolution is really important. Of course, all of these will be made available to you in terms of slides, in terms of resources, so keep that in mind, but keep these terms in mind as we go through this session, as we go through this series. Think about where you're using traditional versus non-traditional, where you're using BIPOC, and if you say BIPOC, do you mean BIPOC, or do you really mean Black students, or do you really mean Latinx students? So being specific in areas where it's necessary, and rooting that in asset-based language is key. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Cindy, because I believe we have a short break before we dive into our session with Dr. Webster.
Indeed. We're just a few minutes ahead of schedule, but I think since this is an hour-and-a-half long session, we're still going to take about a 5-minute break. So if you could rejoin us at 13 after, we'd appreciate it. See you in a few. Right, welcome back. It is 13 after on my clock. So I hope you all had a moment to stretch your legs or energize yourself for the second part of the workshop. I'm going to hand it over to Nicole for the social identity wheel activity. And Nicole, I will be keeping an eye out for the chat and setting out breakout rooms when we need them. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And will you be able to advance the slide? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you may be. We are going to now transition into what I consider the context here, the real core of our time together. And we're going to talk about how our identities, our social identities, really impact how we interact with others, how our students may interact with us, and even how they may interact with them amongst themselves. So before we start, I do want to let you know that we will be using a social identity wheel. We'll put that in the chat, and then we'll move into an activity about that. Next slide, please. All right, so some of you may be asking yourself, why are we even talking about social identities? And so as it was stated earlier, we all come to spaces where we really bring, or we should be bringing, our authentic selves. We should be bringing our whole selves. And for all of us, ourselves make up various components. We're not just one person. So we're going to talk about how these social identities interact with one another. We're going to approach it from the standpoint that these social identities make up our character, make up how we maybe think about things, how we view our ideologies, our context, and our past lived experiences. So when we think about social identities, I want you to think about it from these 4 specific standpoints. First, it's dynamic. So oftentimes when we think about who we are, we may think, oh, I am, so I'll use myself as an example, I'm a woman. But my identity as a woman has changed based on my life experiences, the jobs that I've held, even the places that I've lived. So it's always changing, or we might use the word fluid. We have multiple identities. Oftentimes we may look at someone and say, this is what they are, but we don't know those layers, like an onion, of what really makes up a person. And so when I think about identities in this space, I may think about the cultural identity, their gender, their orientation, and even what I find sometimes what's important in these spaces is their geographical identity. And I think about that because oftentimes we have students who are coming on a college campus that are coming from different areas of the US or even the world, and how we have been shaped to think about things or speak about things shapes our identity. That third piece is our sociological identity, excuse me. And so thinking about, how do we frame or shape ourselves within the context of others and the places and spaces that we are in, and the places that we want to go. And then finally, that our identities are salient. So really thinking about, for many of us, this is who we are. This is the crux of what we bring to the table. And we have to, in the context of this conversation, we really have to understand that when we're asking students or even our colleagues who are in this study abroad space to show up and be their authentic selves, this is really what we're talking about. And so as we move into this next exercise, we really want you to understand and think about your own identities. There will be perhaps what you may perceive as a bit of vulnerability as we move into this next activity. And so this is why we're going to take the first 5 minutes for you to look at this identity wheel and really get to know these particular parts. Oh, thank you. I wasn't ready yet, but that's okay. Look at this identity wheel. So this is going to be the reference in which we're going to use. If I were in a traditional classroom, I would ask, or a traditional setting, face-to-face, I would ask how many of you have used the identity wheel. But because I cannot see all the hands go up, I will just assume that some of you have. The way that it's going to be used today is we want you to do some self-reflection. We want you to think about who you are. Who are you bringing to this space? And understanding the intersectionality. So I know many of you have heard of the term intersectionality. So when Kimberly Crenshaw began to use that term, she was really thinking about it from the perspective of, in her work, she was a Black woman. She was going into these communities, and she was realizing that I'm trying to assess how people are working and living, and I'm trying to create a profile, but I can't create a profile, a true profile of someone without taking in their entire selves. They're a woman or they're a man, and I've heard her speak before, so this was like the original work that she was doing. They identified as being queer. She said all of these identities were making up who this person was. And if I, as a researcher, did not identify and recognize and acknowledge all these identities, then I'm not doing my job. I am not being responsible. And so I want to kind of preface that, because this identity wheel does allow you to take in those identities. that you bring to the table. But it also requires you to perhaps be a bit vulnerable. Perhaps you don't want to share one of your identities, or it's a space that for you want to keep close to you. And we respect that. So what we'd like for you to do, and I'm going to go through the exercise real quickly, and then I'll give you a few moments to look at this. I'd like for you to look at this wheel. It is in the chat, Courtney. Okay, so Courtney has downloaded put the link for the wheel in the chat. What we would like for you to do is to look at the wheel, just become familiar with it. If you've done it before, that's fine. Perhaps you may say, I hadn't thought about it this way, or I'm growing in my own self and I'm looking at it a particular way. So we'd like for you to take about 2 or 3 minutes to look at this. And I want you to think about those pieces that you would like to share out. And if you have discomfort or areas of personal reflection that you would keep close to yourself, that's fine. Could you move to the next slide, please? Okay. So we're at number 2, the self-reflection. Then after the reflection, we're going to move into some small group work. That small group work, we're going to break you into groups of 4, and a set of questions will be posted in the chat. Now, when we move into this exercise, while the spirit of the identity wheel was created for people to look at themselves and the identity that they bring and how you interact and move with people, we want you to think about this from the framing of how your students may interact with you, or how they might interact within the context of a study abroad program. And so you'll see that those questions will be framed from that perspective. So you'll have about 15 minutes in your small groups. And then after that, we will move into a large group discussion. So within your small groups, we would like you to have a meaningful dialogue. We've broken it up into 4 so you don't feel like you're sharing with the larger group. But when we break out into these larger groups, we would ask for people to share. And while we won't have an opportunity for every group to share, we would like a few groups to share out, and you would have about 2 minutes. And we're going to leave about 20 minutes for that discussion. So if I could ask you now to take about 2 minutes, take some time to reflect on that wheel that was posted and the one that was previous to this slide. I'd like for you to focus on those, and even the 5 questions that are in the middle. So I'll read them to you. Identities you think about most often. Identities you think about least often. And perhaps that's where your area of contention is. And maybe you don't want to share that. Your own identities you would like to learn more about. Identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself. And those identities that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. So think about this in the context of you leading a study abroad program or being in an administrative seat of a study abroad office. Think about how students may perceive you when they walk into that office. You're the first face they may see. So take a little bit of time to please focus on those. And then once the 2 or 3 minutes is up, then I don't want to say reconvene because we're not going to break you out into groups just yet. And then we'll have some silent time. Let me put it that way. Cindy's like, yes. Okay, as people are writing, I would like to, or thinking and reflecting before we break out into small groups, I'd like to just provide some more context here. One aspect of the wheel that we receive, when asking, what is the importance of this wheel? And I mentioned earlier is for us to consider our identities. But if you were to do this wheel or this type of activity with students in your own groups, and as you reflect on this, I want you to think about how students' identities critically shape the context of a study abroad program. So when they bring their whole selves, how does that impact their interaction with others? And how does that impact the overall context of the program? It's also a way to begin to open up these conversations about privilege and power that we know happen within our study abroad programs, barriers to inclusion, first languages that are spoken, and those aspects of their identity that peers may or may not see, and why it's important to them. It also is a way to begin to sensitize students to the shared identities that we all share, because oftentimes we focus on the opposite. And so the diversity of identities that we bring into the classroom or bring into a study abroad experience or into a community is just as important. But there are some challenges with doing this particular exercise, or as we think about identities, and we need to be aware of those. So I'll share those with you, and then we'll move into this next exercise. The next part of this is that students may not understand their full selves, or they're still wrestling with a part of their identity that is important to them, but are not sure maybe how to bring that up, and if perhaps it's something that they are just discovering prior to the launching of a study abroad program or going on a study abroad program. So how do we bring that into the context of this activity or the study abroad conversations? And then oftentimes it's, if we are talking about having these discussions, do we need to have the right people in the room? So sometimes we want to have these intimate spaces, but are the right folks in there to facilitate these types of conversations? So I just wanted to share those with you before we break into our groups, because I think it's extremely important for us to understand who needs to be a part of those discussions and why this particular activity is so important.
Well,
So
we do have a question in the chat. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna, would I be able to ask the question now, or would you rather continue?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a participant who's asking, where would family orientation and roles like mother and sister or political orientation fit into this wheel, or are those not appropriate here?
They are completely appropriate, and here's where there's flexibility with this wheel. You have the ability to write in a part of your identity that is not represented here. So I think not water. So sorry, I'm trying to read this and I don't have on my glasses. Is that about the caregiver?
Yeah, so family roles and
Okay,
political orientation.
Yes. So there are different versions of this particular wheel, and some do have political affiliation and other identifiers, but please feel free to add it to the wheel wherever you feel it's most appropriate. And if that's a part of, how you identify, yes, make sure you put it on there. It doesn't have to fit into one of these boxes, but if it's something that's important to you, an identifier that's important to you, please make sure that you include that. Thank you. That's a great question. Same thing with, the political affiliation. And I will share with you, so you have this wheel, but there are other versions of this wheel that you may find more appropriate to use if you wanted to mirror this type of activity with your students. So I can definitely give that to you as well. We can place that in the chat so that you can see that and see how you might use that, or even just want to retake it using those particular markers.
And Nicole, I would just like to add too, when such a great point that Opal brought up in the chat, this idea of when students and you yourselves bring your whole self to whatever space you're coming into, your identities as a caregiver, your political identities, your national identities, all of these things, I think when you put them in different global contexts can mean different things. So, you know, if your political identity is an identity that you hold really dearly, I think coming into that and then going into a space where a political identity isn't valued as much can bring about some interesting discussions and conversations. So even what we value in society and what some cultures deem as salient to identity and makes us who we are can vary from country to country, culture to culture. So having that awareness is also really important too.
Completely agree. Thank you for bringing that to the forefront, because I think about some of the places that I'm in where being a caregiver and a mother is highly valued, and they make that known up front. So I think that sometimes we have to help our students to understand also why we might be going into different situations, different contexts, and those identities that you may not even think of as an identity here in the US hold weight and value in other places. So that's a really important point. Okay, are there any other questions? All right. So we'd like to, does everyone understand the assignment now? You're going to break out into groups. There should be, are the questions in the chat? All right, there we are. So we have 5 questions we want you to think about. What part of your identity do you think people first notice about you? Excuse me. What part of your identity are you most comfortable sharing with other people? Identities have the strongest effect on how you see yourself as a person. Do you agree or disagree, and why? What parts of your identity do you see having the most effect on your interactions with students? And then finally, what parts of students' identities do you most often see affecting and or impacting their interactions with you? And if you want to expand that out even with others, so if you've led study abroad programs and you've seen those interactions with those students, please feel free to talk about that in your small groups. All right, we'd like to open up the chat, the box. Today I'm just not with it. We'd like to open up the spaces for everyone to move into their small groups.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had productive small group discussions. I wanted to apologize because earlier I said that our time together was an hour and a half today, when in fact it is 2 hours. So my apologies for that mistake, and I hope I didn't create any unnecessary confusion. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Webster. Do you need me to share the slides again, Nicole?
Sure. Just the questions.
All right, take it away.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank everyone for, I hope, what was a meaningful time together in your small groups. And we look forward to hearing some of those concepts and ideas that were discussed. And I'll kick it off by saying that Cindy had an opportunity to jump in and out of some of the breakout rooms, and she said one piece that resonated was this idea of age and how, was that correct, Cindy? And how age becomes salient at different times of our lives. And so we are excited to hear what you all came up with. So we didn't assign, group numbers or anything like that, but we really would like at least a couple of groups to begin to just, let's see, by show of hands, maybe someone would want to share some things that they noticed, some concepts or ideas that they discussed in their group. No
Nicole,
one.
I'll keep a lookout too if I see any hands or folks in the chat.
Okay. I don't see hands, but I see a lot of people smiling like, please don't call on me. Gabriella, you're right in front. Jen, I see all these folks laughing, smiling. It's like, oh, bringing back the days of being in the class. Okay. Can I please have someone step to the forefront? And I know that this is a space, might be a vulnerable space, but maybe let's do it this way. Let's start with the question number one. If anyone would like to share what was oh, okay, what you discussed. I see Gabriella. Oh, thank you.
I was going to say not it, but well. In our group, I think one of the main identities that was mentioned was our sex or gender, that as females, that was one of the first things that people noticed, and age as well. So those were the top two.
Okay.
Yes. For the younger colleagues that we were discussing, since they're closer in age to students, that's why that was salient to the students.
So my question would be, for those that are younger in age to your students, does that become problematic as it relates to you being in, in a country and you're seen as not, there's not a hierarchical relationship, but perhaps they're more of a friendship? Does anyone see that, Carol? Is that Caroline or Caroline?
Caroline, it's funny you asked that question because I wanted to add a short comment of, our group said that for those identities, you think of, for us, a lot of the answers were what gender do you present or your race are the most salient. But I also added, for me, maybe it's more of an insecurity, but also my age. So on one sense, and especially since I, dyed my hair, which was a choice of mine, I feel a little concerned that it can make me come across even younger and more traditional professional spaces where colored hair is seen as not professional. So in my experience, a lot of my coworkers have been older than me, and I feel a little bit of that tension sometimes, but also it's the flip side of it might be an advantage where students might be more comfortable with me because I come across more maybe within their age group. So it's kind of a pro con. So yeah, I don't have any good conclusions on that, just that, age can be a little bit complicated in our field.
It can be, and I would say that in some cultures, age is, people who are of a certain age are taken more seriously or revered, and so helping our students to understand that, I think is extremely important. So thank you for sharing. So let's.
I think we have another hand from Clintisha, if I'm pronouncing your name correct.
Okay, that's what I was trying to say.
Hi. So for me, I'll put it into perspective. The seniors that I have were freshmen when I was at my university. Age gets tricky, as mentioned. However, it allows a chance to set up boundaries, and I experienced this when I was studying abroad. My students feel like I can relate to them a bit more because we are a little bit close in age, but then there is that respect factor because they understand that I truly understand some of the things that they are experiencing and that I am a resource. So it works in that nature of they feel like they really have an advocate, really working towards a common goal, really trying to represent them, and that kind of makes that balance instead of it getting a little bit fuzzy in the middle.
Wow. Thank you, Clintisha, for that perspective, because I think we don't, that dual perspective of it working to your advantage in both ways, right? So the wisdom, with age comes wisdom and experience, but also that age being seen as being more relatable because of your age is highly important too. I think it also sets up that notion of trust as well. So thank you for sharing. Okay.
Nicole, I just wanted to add a piece too, as we were talking and thinking about it. This exercise for me also highlighted that there are students who, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, or identity, they feel they're somewhat removed from it because maybe they have a majority identity or a heteronormative identity. So they feel like these questions or issues around identity don't really relate to them. And what I love about you leading us through this exercise, and possibly, all of the practitioners here leading their students or even themselves, realizing there are so many salient parts of our identity that we acknowledge or don't acknowledge, and it changes. So some are fluid, some are static, but helping students see that, and that this conversation is just as much for them as it is for students of historically marginalized groups or backgrounds.
Yes, thank you so much for saying that. And I think hopefully it came through when I talked about this is an opportunity to talk about those similarities, because at some point we've all had the same age, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. But I think it's important, and for students to even hear our journey, as a 20-year-old something, that was in South Africa at that time, that my experience is going to look very different now, but I can still relate to students if I'm taking them there with some of the experiences that I had and differences. Okay. And I see in the chat, I do want to recognize that there's a whole chat going on around generational differences, which I think is extremely important. And I'm not going to read all of those, but I do want to, Sarah, I like your point where you said generational differences can also influence marketing strategies, i.e. where to find students and how to communicate effectively with them. Would you mind, Sarah, just providing some context around that, please? If you feel comfortable sharing out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And we didn't quite get to this in my group, but it's a point that has come up so much for our office, which is, what social media should we be using to communicate with students? Do we go on TikTok or not? Do we go on Discord or not? What is Discord? There's a lot of sort of talk about that. And I think also corollary to that, it's influencing, social media influences students' experiences as well. And so I think it's all sort of wrapped into what we're talking about today and what Jeff said we'll talk about in future.
Thank you. That's extremely important too, because I think how students' entree point into these study abroad programs, whether it be through TikTok or traditional media, I think also shapes how they view how the program might be run. So I have found that students who see this on perhaps the more social media inspired places may have a different perception of the program, even though the content is the same, than those who read about it in a flyer. And we can talk about that a little bit later and what that might look like. Gabriella, I want to get to your point, but yeah, because that's a whole nother conversation. But I do want to, let's see if we have any folks who would like to share out about question number 2. What part of your identity are you most comfortable sharing with other people? Oh, maybe it was the opposite. Folks didn't feel comfortable sharing. All right, so I will kick this one off if folks don't mind. So I've taken students abroad to a number of places, and places where it's French-speaking countries as well as Spanish-speaking. And I usually do not disclose this within the context of my students, but when we go to Spanish-speaking countries, as soon as they hear me speaking Spanish, it's like, oh, wait a minute, she didn't disclose that. And what I don't share is that I am trilingual. And so for students, when they find that out, I tell them the story in the background that I did not see that as an asset growing up. I always felt like the odd man out, and using my language skills now I know is a gift, and I'm gladly wear that on my sleeve, but it's really interesting when students begin to realize those parts of our identity that maybe they are shielding or hide. I don't want to say hiding, but keeping close to their chest pocket, because I've had some other students who then came out and said, you know, I'm Afro-Latina, or I'm this because, you know, I speak this language or what have you. So I think that that's really, really interesting. I think to some degree, if we can be a bit vulnerable in these spaces, but sharing who we are, so students understand that identity makes up all of who we are, but why maybe some parts of our identity we choose to keep close. Maybe it brings up you know, emotional memories that we don't want to, you know, to uncover. So I'll just share that. And I want to respect if no one else has anything to share.
I can share something that was shared in our group.
Okay.
One thing that we talked a little bit about in terms of being comfortable sharing with students and connecting with them was, for instance, sharing if you're first gen or low income, and helping that to, from an advising standpoint, helping to connect with students and sort of just mirroring the fact that even if you are identified this way or have these certain circumstances, that you can still study abroad. So being just, you know, first generation student as well, and me too kind of thing, or low income student. We had some discussion in our group about that.
Wow, thank you, Ramona, for sharing. I think that's really important for students to be able to identify. We talk about representation, and I think oftentimes representation is that physical, what we see, but being able to share those pieces that I think sometimes are invisible to the naked eye are extremely important, and it helps to create that rapport that we know is extremely important in these spaces. So thank you.
Nicole, can I add to that as well? Ramona, that really resonated with me because I think about that thinking about the wheel, the socioeconomic status, that's not something that I ever saw as a salient part of my identity growing up. And it wasn't until I went to college when I started filling out the FAFSA and all those forms that I realized, oh, I'm a Pell eligible student, or I'm first gen. All of this language, you know, was new to me. I was just, you know, my parents are both from Jamaica. They'd never been to college before, but I didn't, the kind of deficit-based language around that hadn't permeated my identity until I got to college. And so I also think too, when we think about the language that we used around identity, how much of it is static and how much will shift. And I think it's really important to show students, if you're a first income, a low income or first gen, there are others like you in this space, but also that doesn't have to be the beginning and ending of who you are as a student, right? You are not Noelle, the Pell eligible student or the scholarship student, right? So how much of that do I own as a part of my identity? Or kind of, I think, Jeff, you were mentioning this when we were chatting earlier, this is part of my identity that's not static, right? It's going to change, potentially, moving, ebbing and flowing, but that's something that always comes up for me as it pertains to socioeconomic status and how that affects how I see myself and how others may view me.
Thank you, Noelle, for sharing. And Izzy put, I was trying to read the chat. Izzy put something in the chat as well about how their group briefly discussed in relation to this question is what parts of our identity are hidden, that we have the option to share versus parts which are more visible and we may not be able to hide with the opportunity to share on our own terms. So Izzy, I really love that, being able to share on your own terms. So what may be visible may be the part that I don't want to talk about, and what may be hidden sometimes it may be the opposite. So thank you for sharing that, and recognizing that is a part of this conversation. All right, so let's move on to the third question. So those identities that have the strongest effect on how you see yourself as actually, I'd like to move to question 4 in lieu of time. So what parts of your identity do you see having the most effect on your interactions with students? So that could be students in your program or students who come into your office. So what are those parts? Or even with your staff, because oftentimes the staff, if we're working in a larger group, the staff may be those frontline individuals, but shape the tone of our programs. Are there any thoughts on that? Okay, Dawn, yes, thank you.
I guess for me, I try to maybe look at some of my parts of my identity to where I'm trying to relate with the students or something maybe they've shared with me, but also that we could be able to have that rapport, that connection, and try to help them feel more comfortable. Or maybe I'm feeling something that they want to share, but they're not ready to, that kind of thing, to sort of feel the whole process out. Because for our study abroad, for semester and longer term programs, it's required advising. So I'm seeing the majority of our students, and even with faculty led, we're moving towards the model of very much encouraging it. So that way we can help them throughout the process. And I think that's something that I've sort of, over my wonderful years of being in the field, that I see age, there's pros and cons to it, but it's something that I'm able to, to really utilize to help them throughout the process and see how we can better connect and help them tap into maybe some of those different identities they didn't even think about. And then there's different identities for me, or knowing that I'm, a white first generation female from Northeast Ohio, born on a farm, to where what is their identity? Where are they coming from? To where if I try to be as open as possible, so then hopefully it'll reciprocate. But also I know that there's where I have, I can't always relate with them, they can't always relate with me, but for us to come together and figure out what that looks like.
Thank you, Dawn, for those comments and really sharing, how you're using this or using this within the context of your own program. I want to move over to, Cindy, yes.
Yes, I think for me, one of the parts of my identity that seemed particularly important in my interactions with, I think, both students and colleagues is the fact that I present as a white woman and I identify as a white woman, which of course historically, when you look at study abroad participation, is the group that's been overrepresented and that has, at least in the context of the United States, most closely been associated with study abroad. And so I'm very aware of that identity in my interactions with students and colleagues, especially because we're so focused on making sure that we are more inclusive in terms of our outreach and who is able to access these potentially transformative learning opportunities. And so really just paying attention to that dynamic and also paying attention to whose other voices, especially students, are elevating to avoid the very common perception that study abroad is something that feel historically, at least, white female students have been able to partake in. And I think on the sort of another layer on this is when you look at who actually gets to lead study abroad programs. And I think there's a similar underrepresentation issue going on there. And I think those dynamics are different, but they're still important to consider as well. So actually my work in the context of study abroad is mostly focused on convincing faculty to propose and lead study abroad programs. And again, in my identity as a white woman, how do I encourage faculty of different backgrounds to consider study abroad and support them in the process as needed?
Thank you for those comments, Cindy. I think what struck me from what you said is, your identity and how you identify, and being able to have these, I think, sometimes very difficult conversations about voice, representation, but who's leading? So because oftentimes when we think about the context of who's shaping these programs, if it's coming from a space of someone who might be from one of these, from a historically marginalized or ignored group, is that going to look different? Is that going to impact the types of students that are coming into those programs? And so I think giving thought to that is not only needed, but necessary. So thank you. All right, any other comments? Okay. All right, so let's move to the last question. What part of students' identities do you most often see affecting or impacting their interactions with you or with others in their group? Yes, Sue.
Yeah, hi. I think for me, I work at a community college, and I think the identity of a first-generation student seeking out study abroad, to me, is the largest conversation I typically have. And as first-generation students, oftentimes they have not had a lot of opportunity to travel internationally, so it's a socioeconomic barrier as well. And so I gave an example in our small group, but I think it's relevant here in students who haven't ever applied for a passport and not understanding the process. I had a first-generation student who waited until he received his acceptance letter to then ask when I was going to tell him to apply for his passport. Even though the document said, you know, you should do this right away, he wasn't necessarily reading, as most students don't, but recognizing that there was no one necessarily in his family environment that was helping him understand how the process would work. That was an important revelation for me, to recognize not all students are coming in with the same amount of background and support at home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how does that translate into maybe aspects of how you are doing your, or not how you're doing, but how you are facilitating, you know, language or the outline of the program? Does that have any bearing on that?
Yeah, I think it's just not making assumptions and you know, having to get feedback on every experience I have with a student to say what identities might have come into play in the process that they went through, so that I can change the way I discuss in the future to make sure I bring things up, just not knowing. It's every student is so different in their knowledge coming in. And some of those identities might play a role in that. So
I think that that's extremely important. Thank you for sharing. And something that we take for granted, that we know, those of us who do travel or in these spaces, we know, oh, that's commonplace. You see how it can impact even a student's ability to travel if they haven't done that. So thanks for sharing. Would anyone else like to share or have an example? Now here we know you all were not quiet in your groups. I know you all were chit-chatting. See, look at those smiling faces. Okay, I'm going to choose one person. Louise.
Jennifer has her hand up.
Oh, Jennifer. See, Louise, you were saved by the bell there. Okay.
Thank you. We talked in our group about how I think questions 4 and 5 actually fit pretty well together, and I think they affect one another. And I shared in our group that I really have a passion for wanting to make sure that we have students from a wide variety of identities who are traveling on our programs and feeling comfortable applying and you know, feeling like this is an option for them. But I think it's also important that we don't just attract those students, but we also support them while they're on our programs. And I think we could do that better. And I had this aha moment about this past fall when I had a student who was a student who identified as Black and female, who was on one of our programs in France and was really struggling because she just didn't really see anyone in the place where she was who looked like her. And I didn't know until the very end of the semester that she was struggling, because she didn't share that with me, but she shared it with one of my Black male colleagues. And I happened to be in his office and she called and we talked about it. And I was really upset because I felt like I want to support her. I want to be able to, you know, when we have these students go on our programs, I want to provide the support they need. And I think it was really interesting to me, and it's obvious, I understand it. But, you know, she didn't feel comfortable talking to me about her struggles. She felt comfortable talking to someone who looked more like her. And I get it. And at the same time, I feel like I want to be better at this. And I struggle with that. I shared in the group, this is why I'm here, because it's just something I've been thinking about a lot lately, that I think sometimes it's not just about the students' identities and my identity, but I think it's about that relationship between the two.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jennifer. You bring up, I think, what is helps to sum this up, that we all have shared identities. Well, let me say, we all have identities and representation matters. But if we can begin to break down some of these barriers of what people perceive us to be, I think that we can be in a better position to create those stronger relationships and bonds between ourselves and our students. So what we will do, we're going to ask if there are any more any more comments or any other points they would like to share before we turn it over to Noelle. I will say this, I've been taking notes of what people have been saying, some of those pieces that they're struggling with. And I would like to provide you all with some other resources that you may find helpful in this space as you're navigating, the notion of identity, or how do you better relate to students who don't share what you would see as an outward shared identity with you. And then also, I will make sure to share another version of this wheel, and hopefully you will see some value in this tool that we use today, and it's something that you might use with your own groups. All right, we have one more comment, and that is something from Elise, who says, something I've been thinking about during this conversation is how to create space or time in our work with our students to actually do this important work. We are always time crunched with advising sessions, so a discussion in the future about this would be helpful for me. So that was Inez, right? No, Elise. So Elise, I will definitely say, and I'm going to speak for Noelle as well, for those of you who would like for us to perhaps come in and do some of this with you virtually, we're definitely open and available to that, and amenable to that, because we do think it's important. And I think sometimes you need to take that heavy load off of trying to do it yourselves and have someone else come in. So we're more than willing to come in and do that, help do that for you.
And it's actually a great segue, not quite segue, but our next workshop is going to focus on supporting students from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds in their sort of pursuit of study abroad. And so we actually will be talking about how to have these conversations with our students. So be sure to be back for those conversations. I'm not necessarily sure that we can magically make the time for it, but we'll provide some resources to help facilitate those conversations. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Noelle.
Thank you so much. I was snapping and nodding so much because of what everybody's been sharing and commenting. And before we talk about the homework and journaling, just to amplify what Nicole and Cindy said, I think this is so amazing, these spaces that IDEAS and we put together, because we're connecting each other. We're connecting all of these different organizations and people who can assist in doing that work. So, Jennifer, I really appreciate your experience in sharing that, because from that experience, from the experience that Sue had with her first gen student with a passport, we can have a lens on each phase of the pre-departure of the study abroad process, right? So, what does our office diversity look like? What does our resources for various identities look like? It can help us start to ask those questions so that when we do have the time, right, when we create the time, we can make those changes. So it may just be starting an affinity group in your study abroad office so that other Black and Brown and Indigenous and LGBTQ+ students have resources with their peers, or an affinity group within your university, you know, connecting different university resources that you have at your disposal. So again, really appreciate all these comments. And I think that leads me into talking about our homework. So I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Ibram Kendi's work and book about being an anti-racist. We thought this would be a great inclusion in this section of our workshop experience, because a lot of the work that we do, you know, we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. I feel like that's something that in our lexicon has become popular, and it's becoming something that a lot of organizations are talking about. But what does that mean? How does it impact our day-to-day and our student study abroad experience, and why is it important? And I feel like this continuum, which was adapted from Ibram's book about becoming an anti-racist, what I thought was really powerful is this continuum and this spectrum that was created. So right now, you know, looking at this spectrum, it's broken down into 3 different zones, right? You have the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone, which this will be provided to you. And definitely, if you haven't had the chance to read his book, I find it quite interesting, and it can help shed some light and give you more insight into working with diverse perspectives. But when you look at this spectrum, as a homework assignment, we want you to think about where you are on this spectrum. So we look at the first spectrum, it's talking about the fear zone. I deny racism as a problem. I avoid hard questions. I strive to be comfortable. I talk to others that look like me. So whether you're thinking about, you know, dismantling systems of oppression and racism, or you're even just thinking granular, like in my study abroad space as a professional, if I'm a white cisgendered female, do I feel uncomfortable talking to my students of various identities, or am I in a learning zone and I feel comfortable talking about it, but I'm just quite not sure what to do next? Or are you in a full-on growth mode and you have asked yourself those tough questions and you're ready to advocate for changes in your university system to make sure it is truly inclusive and truly equitable? So we want to give you this homework assignment to reflect on where you see yourself on Kendi's continuum, what phase most accurately describes where you are, and then how you hope to move forward in the phase. With that, this is your homework assignment as you prepare for our next session in this series. We do have a survey that we'd love for you to complete at the end of this session, but this is your homework assignment, so be sure to reflect on it, and hopefully it will help you all become even more inclusive practitioners. And the fact that you're here speaks volumes, so your students will only benefit from all the work that you're continuing to do. So thank you. I'll share the screen with Cindy, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks to the presenters for sharing their expertise today. Courtney did put the link to the survey in the chat. We want to hear from you about your feedback for today's session, and we look forward to seeing you all next week, where we focus on supporting underrepresented students, and it'll definitely, I promise, pick up on the conversation that has been happening in the chat. So we will follow up, or rather our colleagues at World Learning will follow up with an email with homework and the survey, and then either way, we'll see you next week. Thank you.